Now more than ever, innovative technologies are fueling change and sparking new ways of thinking. Collaboration between corporations and startups is key to staying at the forefront of these trends. However, finding the right startups can be expensive, time-consuming, and ineffective. But Plug and Play is here to help. As a corporate partner, you will gain access to a whole ecosystem of innovation. Discover startups that meet your tech interests. Stay updated on the latest trends and network with industry peers. We will help you during every stage of your innovation journey, no matter where you are and where you want to go. Get in touch today.
All right, but thank you everybody for joining. I'm glad Adam's the speaker today because I do have laryngitis, but I'm happy to have you all here again. This is meant to be a more interactive presentation, rather than a webinar. And so please ask your questions freely. You can type them, you can turn your camera on and put your speaker on and ask them yourself. But otherwise, we're really excited to have Adam here. Where's the future farming really taking us? It's a huge question. It should be a big discussion that should be talked about. And so Adam is the managing director for Clean Energy Transition Group and the global head of Ag Tech Investment Banking at Citi Bank. So we're excited to have him. So Adam, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. And I'm excited to be here. I know this is my, third or fourth time talking with you guys. And to me, I just appreciate the work you're doing because it's important to have you and Lindsay and others on your team really helping to support all these next generation of ag tech leading companies. So that's why I get excited. So I'm always excited to just talk and tell people about what I'm seeing and give a little insight. So as I said, I'd love to make this interactive. It makes it particularly helpful. Let me just do something. I'm going to pull up a screen just so we can get this going. So let me jump in. So we're going to talk the future of farming will take us, and to me, it's going to take us to disruption throughout the entire food system. And to me, it's not only happening now, but it's accelerating. And I think it's useful to really talk about this. First, I will go to the next page, which is some information about disclaimers, because I work at a large bank and we have to make disclaimers all the time. So everyone's seen that. We've made our disclaimers. Let's get into the interesting stuff now. I like to talk about there's three really interesting things that are all occurring simultaneously right now that are going to lead to really tremendous changes throughout the food and ag sector. So let's go back to 50 years ago. I'm not sure many or if any of the people on here were actually alive then, but really back in the 1970s, there was a view that society was growing so quickly from a population perspective that we were not going to be able to feed the population. And we had famine and other issues in the 80s and a lot of challenges out there. And it really led to a view that the only way we could be successful in feeding the world was through industrial agriculture. And if you look forward to today, in many regards, we have been incredibly successful. Now, there are definitely people who don't have enough food, but in most places, it's not due to an inability to grow enough food. It's mostly for other reasons. Today, it's going to be because of the conflict between the Ukraine and Russia, which is going to lead to tremendous issues, particularly in the Middle East, potentially in India and some other regions. But generally, there's been enough food to go around. Again, understand not everyone has enough, but there's generally been enough. And industrial agriculture was one of the key reasons for that. However, while that was successful in making enough food, we've seen a number of really significant issues emerge that have led to what I'd say is a backlash. And the three key ones that I talk about are the environmental impact. So we've had terrible impact to our soil. We've had terrible impact to groundwater. We've had it to lakes, rivers, streams, and oceans. And there's been pollution there, and it's led to real damage that's impacted our ability to really grow food. And it's been a major problem. So that's one. Industrial agriculture also allowed the amount of disposable income spent on food to drop from about 18% to 10%. So the food we eat is significantly cheaper as a percentage of our income than it's ever been. Unfortunately, what we're eating often these days tend to be empty calories that aren't particularly nutritious. And as a result of that, we've seen a real steep change, and we've led to tremendous negative health implications. If you think about the percentage of people, not just in America, but globally, who are obese and have diabetes and other health issues caused by not eating healthy, it's a problem, and candidly, it's getting worse. And then the third area that I think is really important to talk about is the quality and taste of the food we eat has deteriorated. When you're making and growing food focused on really how much you can produce and logistics to get it to the right location, you run into tremendous issues of not being then optimizing for taste. So if you think about it, we grow today for yield and ability for shipping. We don't grow for taste. So all of that has really led to a backlash against industrial agriculture. At the same time, what we're seeing is that a new type of consumer is emerging due to technology and other issues. And when I say that, what do I mean? Well, for those of us who've been around a little while, we're used to shopping as going to the grocery store. If you go back more than 10 or 15 years, your only ability to shop was you went to the grocery store. Yes, there could be a corner market, there might be something else generally, but most people went to the grocery store. What we've seen due to technology and really other options over the past decade is an ability for the consumer to change how they shop. And particularly since the pandemic started, and a lot of people didn't want to hang out at supermarkets. So what's happened? Well, consumers now are able to go and get food online. They can go shopping online. We've seen a huge amount of people who get delivery of their food. We see a growing amount of people who get meal kits. In my family, we get Tavala. We've seen a lot of just generally delivery from restaurants. And what does this mean? Well, it means that the old relationship between customer and what I'd say retail and CPG was you'd go into the supermarket and you look for the product you want. And if they didn't have it, you either bought something that could substitute for it or you left empty-handed. Well, that's just not the case anymore. And in that scenario, retail and CPG were in charge and the customer was more or less a taker. Because of the options that we have today, the consumer is in charge, and they are driving change to both retail and consumer in ways I don't think people had thought of before. And then the third thing is the impact of climate change. And this is one that I think it's often people don't fully perceive the challenge here. Because I think a lot of people say, oh, climate change, it's leading to warmer weather and drier weather. And if we actually knew exactly what was going to happen because of climate change, then we could actually make seeds that could be all right to grow in warmer weather and with less water. Unfortunately, when I look at climate change these days, what I think about is really unpredictable weather. And I'm sitting here in San Francisco, and it's early April, and yesterday was almost 90. Well, San Francisco really isn't a place where it gets 90 degrees, but sure doesn't get it as we're turning from winter into spring. And if you look around the country, it's really interesting to see how temperatures change. And again, in ways that have never happened before. It was unusual to see cities have a 30 or 40 degree change in temperature over a week. But if you look at cities these days, it's not that unusual now for temperatures to go up and down. And additionally, the other thing is these unpredictable storms happening. If you think about that huge equivalent to a hurricane that hit Iowa about 2 years ago that wiped out, I think, a third of the corn crop, those are storms that we just aren't used to, and you really can't prepare. As I said to someone recently, I'm not aware of any genetics being done by any companies making corn seeds that are focused on being able to withstand 120-mile-an-hour wind. It doesn't seem like a good use of focus on genetics, but that's what we're facing. So right now, you have these three really important things happening that together are going to and driving a more sustainable food system. So I think the key starting point is this page of all these changes that are happening and what that's going to mean. So if I go to the next page, really what I like to then talk about is all of this is happening at the same time that some other really important trends are happening. And what is it? Well, it's fresher, healthier, and more nutritious food that's grown sustainably and is tastier. So let's take each of these one at a time. So if you look in box one, fresher, healthier, more nutritious foods, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about a consumer who is looking for different things. They are looking for food that's freshly grown. They're looking for food that's healthier and more nutritious. What is it leading to? Well, it's leading to a tremendous amount of change in how people are pursuing food consumption and diets. Whether it's this movement for alternative protein, and we always hear about clean labels, and what else are we going to do with there's a growing number of people focused on veganism and ethical consumption and fair trade and all these other areas. These are all topics that people are talking about, and people are eating really differently than in the past. I think for the general family who sits down to eat, I'm sure if it's like my family, they often have a challenge. I'm not sure that all four people in my family eat the same way anymore, and it's clearly making life much more challenging. But I don't think this is a fad. I think this is a trend, and I think it's going to continue. I also think it's a sign that after many years of just, again, being a consumer, and I say that in the term of just a taker of food, I think the consumer is sitting there saying, you know what? I want to play a larger, more upsized role in food and what's being eaten and what decisions I'm making about what I'm putting in my body. And I think that's only going to continue going forward, and is really important. The other part in the next one is consumers are demanding more sustainable products. So there's no doubt about that, particularly as you talk to millennials and Gen Zs, amongst others. Sustainability is a key. And you look at some of the statistics here about people wanting to support companies that are purpose-driven and recommend them to their friends and families. There's just a view that the company is now going to be judged not only on its product quality and its product taste, but what's its sustainability roadmap? Where is it going? What does its packaging look like? How is it growing its food? How is it treating its employees? How is it doing all of these things that make a brand different today than it would have been a decade or two? And I, as someone who comes from a sustainability background, just continue to see more and more companies focused on how are they going to be able to feed people in the future using less resources, not even equivalent, but less resources, because we do have issues of how much water is going to be out there. We do have issues around how can we grow with less chemical fertilizer? How do we use less pesticides? How do we use less crop nutrients? All of it, stuff we're going to have to deal with, and sustainability is a huge component. Then I get to three, and I think three is one of those underappreciated areas right now, because anytime we shift from a consumer, which, let's be honest, all of us are consumers, we all eat food, we all make decisions in that range. We go to 3, and now we're talking about farmers. And I know on this call, we have people who are either farmers or connected to the ag sector very closely. But let's think about this. What percentage of Americans today have connectivity to the ag sector? Very few of them. There's very few people who grow up on farms, and there's very few people who have this affinity for the ag sector like people would have done 100+ years ago, when a number of people would have grown up on farms and maybe they still live there or migrated to cities but had that background. I often joke that my family is no different. It happens that my father-in-law is retired but used to be a dairy farmer. But if you ask my kids where milk comes from, I'm 50-50, they'd say the store rather than a cow. So I just think that disconnection between the consumer and where and how food is growing has made people underappreciate farming and ag. But what are we seeing? I think this, to me, is one of the most exciting things. Right now, we're talking about tech and innovation. I often say technology is not frequently invented specifically for the ag sector, but is often taken from other industries where it's developed, commercialized, scaled, and validated, and brought into ag. And that's much better, because I think the ag sector is much less willing to be a first user of new technology, but is much more willing to use it once it's been validated in other industries. So let's talk about some of the stuff on here, because I think it's really important to talk about what this tech and innovation is. So let's start. We've got CRISPR. So we've got this advancement that was in genetics done in humans initially, and now we're seeing it used in ag. It's very interesting. And in some places, it's going to be interesting to see how it's received. Is CRISPR the equivalent to GMO? Are consumers going to accept CRISPR in a way that they did not GMO products? And doesn't matter. And again, most of our GMO is in row crops and products that are not eaten directly by consumers, whether it's soy or wheat or corn. It's usually processed in another product. But how do we feel about CRISPR for our tomatoes? How do we feel about CRISPR for our carrots or leafy greens or other products? Are people comfortable with it? Do they have questions? I think it's too early to tell, but it's going to be interesting to see how that technology comes along. Blockchain, probably the word of the year back in like 2017 or 2018. It was a word everyone kept talking about. Let's be honest, most people had no idea what it was, but it was in vogue, so people used the word blockchain. I can tell you today, it's still not being used a tremendous amount in the ag sector. What I'm starting to see is an opportunity for people to use it from a safety and traceability perspective, from the farm all the way to the fork. We're starting to see more of that. The problem or the challenges around it is when you think about how blockchain's going to work, there's a cost to it. And consumers in many regards don't like to pay for costs. It's not something that's useful to consumers to think about. Everyone loves to see where the label is and where it comes from. But if you told the consumer they're paying 5 cents for that, I'm not sure anyone's going to be excited by it. So I think, again, another interesting technology. On a couple of these other ones, whether it's AI, it's data analytics, it's machine learning, I think you're seeing a newfound ability to use technology in the farm. And by that, and I'll talk a little bit about this after, I think we're seeing people starting to use these for precision agriculture. And I think it's really important to think about the farm and what precision agriculture could mean. It can mean a farmer using less crop nutrients, less pesticides, less chemicals, which both will be better for us as consumers, better for them as people who are in the fields when stuff is sprayed, and better for the bottom line. If they can grow just as well and optimize growing using less, it's clearly going to be more profitable. And I think it's going to be useful as whether it's drones and satellites in the sky and sensors. There's just an opportunity to use data in ways we haven't. On I'll talk a little bit more on the next page around fintech as well, because I think fintech is a real interesting and important area for the ag sector, and robotics and automation, advanced materials as well. But I think it's technology that's really going to drive a lot of this, and it's exciting. And then the last thing is the food and ag companies themselves. And I often talk about this because I think it's really important. When I started in my first role around sustainability 2 decades ago, it was around renewable energy. And one of the things that was really interesting from a renewable energy perspective was the energy players looked at what we were doing and kind of laughed dismissively, and kind of, I say to people all the time, I don't like the term alternative protein for the same reason I didn't like the term alternative energy. It makes it sound like this small niche misfit industry that no one wants to be part of. There was energy, which was what everyone did. And then there was this little side thing called alternative energy that people didn't believe in. And to that point, we never got the energy guys really to fully buy in. And then when I was doing work around utility technologies like LED lights and smart grids and smart meters, same thing. The utilities never really bought in. Yes, did they say we'd validate and test technology? Sure. Might they make a little investment? But they didn't think it was real. And then as we went to the third area of clean tech where I worked, which was mobility and transportation, everything from natural gas vehicles, EVs, EV infrastructure, shared mobility and autonomy, we saw more buy-in. But again, the big 3 US automakers were late to electrification, and they still are late if you compare them to where Tesla is today, and they weren't all in. What's been fascinating to me is thinking about the large food, beverage, and ag companies. They've been early to embrace tech innovation. They've been early to embrace ag tech and food tech companies. They've made lots of investments. They have external innovation teams. They see the future. And part of it is because of fear. They don't want to get disintermediated from their consumers and see a future of alternative protein. And if they don't have alternative protein products, then they clearly don't even matter in that market anymore. Or there's other technologies. How does indoor farming play out here? I can tell you from my conversations, the large ag companies and food companies are sitting there thinking, there's an interesting future ahead of us. We still are the largest players in this sector. We have strong capital and balance sheets. We have significant relationships with the distribution side. And we're not going to just move over and let technology and new companies replace us. So there's a lot of real change that's happening. And I think it's pretty exciting at this point. So I'm going to pause for a second because I've been speaking a little while. And I'll jump into some other things. But first, I'd be interested to know if anyone has any questions. And if not, I'm happy to continue. But I always like to take a break and see if others have any questions as I'm going through this.
Yeah, I had a question, Adam.
Sure.
In your upper left corner here of this slide, how important is it that a food be all of those things or just one? How should we think about that?
Are you talking about the USDA organic and fair trade and things of that nature? Or
I'm talking about, yeah, I mean, really all of the boxes and logos that you have in there.
So honestly, I think it's going to be very hard to be all things to all people, as the phrase says. I think what you're going to want to do is figure out the right trend. And let me give an example, because it's one I often talk about. So we saw tremendous growth in the alternative protein sector for alternative meat with Beyond and Impossible. We know the numbers because they're public. So Beyond has run into some challenges, and its numbers, and particularly its projected growth, is slower than where it was expected, because it's said that. And why? So let's think about how much progress we've made in the alternative protein sector, but also how much more we need to achieve. If you think where we were 5 years ago, alternative protein in my mind were garden burgers in your freezer that could have been used for hockey pucks. And then it could have been some years ago on my table, this really scary thing called tofurkey appeared, that one of my sisters who's vegan brought, and I words couldn't describe it. It just wasn't to me the most edible thing. But let's think about what happened with Beyond and Impossible. They did something I think many people would have been shocked they were able to achieve. They left where we were in this frozen case, and they moved right next to ground beef. That's a tremendous success. And I think what we saw is consumers took that as validation that, you know what, how different is this in meat? I don't think the same consumer who picked up Impossible and Beyond the first time, and again, most of who they're appealing to are traditional meat eaters, so it's not like they were going after the vegan. That same person who picked up Beyond and Impossible the first time, there's probably a 0% chance that person would have gone and picked up a garden burger in the frozen section. So we got it to be, okay, this is real. And we had a lot of success, and it got mainstream success because Burger King put a huge amount of capital behind the Impossible Whopper, and Dunkin' did their commercials, I remember, with Snoop Dogg and the breakfast sandwich, and everyone was getting behind it. And there was a lot of progress made. But one could argue there was a tremendous amount of progress made on marketing and putting a next generation product out there, but it was still not good enough. And I think that's one of the things we've seen today is if you want to get market adoption long term, you need to get over this barrier. Yes, 8% of people are vegan in the US now, or 6 to 8%, and it's growing great. And you know what? As long as all the people on this webinar are alive, it's not going to be 50% vegan, and we're going to be eating meat for a long time. So what's been the inhibitor? Well, I personally think there's two inhibitors that have hurt the leaders of plant-based protein today. One is taste, and the other is nutrition. And to me, until those 2 points are solved, I still think Beyond and Impossible are going to struggle to grow at the same levels that we've seen previously. And maybe there's going to be new entrants who will appeal more to most consumers because there's either a better taste and or a product that's healthier. And until that point, I think we could talk about labels and we could talk about all this other stuff, but I always go back to the following. When we go sit down to eat, almost all of us are going to choose for something that tastes good. Whether if you can get these components onto them, whether it's clean label or fair trade, that's fantastic. But if you give a consumer an option in most cases between something that tastes good and something that hits one of these labels, most of them are still going to go for taste. And that's what I think I've learned from our experience on kind of this Gen 2 of alternative proteins. Is that helpful, David? Okay. Melissa.
Awesome. First of all, Adam, this is a fantastic slide. I mean, this is really, really incredible. And really quickly to piggyback on the Beyond Meat and Impossible Burger, I think it's really interesting because, like you said, it isn't vegans who go for it, it's traditional meat eaters, because the two top toppings that are served on those are cheese and bacon. When I found that out, my mind was blown. And secondly, I think that consumers, even outside of probably our audience and the people who we associate with, are starting to realize, okay, like both of those products are not very good for you. And the carbon footprint of making them is actually exponentially worse than beef. So that was just to kind of sum up my additional thoughts on that. But your number 3 section, I love that. And I guess the thing that I would be curious how you're thinking about it, and maybe it would be like an umbrella over all of these areas, would be subscription. So for example, you know, John Deere now that has more computer engineers than mechanical, and some whisperings and rumors of things like See and Spray technology and other things moving towards subscription base. Do you think that that would be a layer that can be layered on top of those categories, or is that really going to start to become its own section? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't think it'll be its own section. I think we're going to see, and I didn't talk about this at all, but it's one of the topics I often speak about is, I think for the farm to be most effective, we're going to need a platform technology that everything's going to sit on. And I often talk about starting with the soil, because to me, the soil in many regards is the most important part of the farm, because if your soil's dead, you don't grow anything. So nothing else matters. So starting with an ownership of the soil, which to me is really interesting, because an ownership of the soil is everything from crop nutrients to crop protection, everything from irrigation. It's really the foundation for this whole platform. And to your point, I often hear talking with people, and again, maybe it's a little different because sitting in California and in the role I play with Western growers as a tech advisor, I think that the specialty guys think of equipment maybe a little differently, and they're not as used to using a lot of this machinery and equipment. So we've actually seen, I guess it'd be the HaaS model, hardware as a service, growing more and more, because the farmers maybe don't want to own the equipment, but they're happy to use it and lease it. And the other thing that's really interesting, and I had this conversation with someone that I think is very important to understand. Farmers aren't computer scientists or engineers, and they sure aren't looking to integrate different software platforms on their own. And one of the things about some of the equipment that was interesting is that first generation on the farm that was being used was still early stage in many regards, and as a result, it had problems. And the farmer didn't have an engineer on staff to fix it when it stopped working. And so in many regards, the companies, if they want to get traction, they needed to own it. And they needed to fix it when it had a problem. And the farmer was happy to use it and happy to pay for it. But they didn't want to be in charge of it. And they sure didn't want to be the one who was trying to integrate its software so it could do a multitude of things. They want companies who can bring a platform to them and say, here, we can do everything you need. Let us be that partner.
Interesting.
Any other questions before I jump back in? Yes, Max, go ahead.
I found it very interesting what you said, that things that are good for the planet but don't taste good enough or haven't hit the benchmarks of taste are not going to succeed. And yet earlier in the presentation, you said that we've sort of been programmed to accept that things just don't taste good, that come out of the ground. They've been selected for bulk production and hardiness, or to grow under a certain set of circumstances with the addition of pesticides and fertilizers and various other agricultural inputs. And I'm wondering if you have any insight as to the transition of the consumer mindset from food should taste good to food should just be grown in abundance, and it's okay if it doesn't taste very good, and how maybe either people were duped into believing that, or if there are any psychological strategies that can be used to sort of reverse that understanding of what food should be in the modern.
So I would say this, when I said food doesn't taste as good, I was giving a comparison to what it would have tasted about 30, 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. I will tell you that I would still take a lot of that food over what we're seeing coming out of the alternative protein guys. So it's still definitely better. I think the consumer doesn't know what good food tastes like. And I often give the example. I remember maybe it was 6 years ago, I went to visit Plenty, which is an indoor farm. And I was really skeptical, because why would an indoor farm be in San Francisco, which is 60, 70 miles away from where all the produce in America is grown? It doesn't make a lot of sense. And to me, New York or Chicago or Atlanta, that fine, makes sense, but 60 miles away. And I went to taste it and I said, wow, this is the best produce I've ever tasted. And I said, what's the technology? And they said, look, generally there's not huge technology here. We're finding and growing produce for taste rather than logistics or yield. And they said, our number one priority is to be close enough to the market that we can get it to the consumer much quicker than they typically would get it. And because of that, we don't have to worry about it not lasting long enough. And let's be honest, we all live in a world where typically we get berries from the market. And if you make it to that third or fourth day and you can finish it, you're like ecstatic. I frequently find by day 3 at the least, some of my stuff's turning moldy. So it's a challenge. And by the way, worst of all, I was reading an article yesterday, a number of those berries are some of the worst foods to eat in terms of how much fungicides, chemicals, and other things they have on them.
Take fresh berries away from me too, please.
I'm not going to. I just wash them a lot better now.
Okay.
But that's the challenge we're talking about. So I think I think we have to figure out how to educate the consumer so they know what better tasting food tastes like. And we've been, let's be honest, we've kind of lived in society of size versus taste, where we supersize everything. And by the way, back to a sustainability conversation, I did an article, I don't know, 1 or 2 years ago now on food waste mitigation, and I was shocked to learn, everyone knows the stats that 30 to 40% of what we're growing doesn't get consumed. That's known. I was shocked to learn that 20% of what goes into a landfill each year is food waste. That was a shocking statement to think about how little room we have in some of these landfills, and a fifth of it's coming from food we don't eat. It was just a real surprise to me. But I think people, again, have focused on quantity, which is leading to obesity and other health problems, rather than taste, because food was so cheap that you just give everyone more. I know it might not taste as good, but just eat more, it'll be fine. And I think we have to reevaluate that and go back to a time of, you know what, 1, you don't need to eat as much, and 2, what you eat, you should really enjoy. It shouldn't be, oh, wow, that's a huge piece of whatever, I'm going to eat it, and while it's not the greatest tasting, I'll get full over time and I'll overeat. Rather than let's eat to the right amount, but eat something better.
Right. Yeah, well said. And to that point, I'm dropping in the chat right now a recommendation for further reading for everybody, a book about this very topic, what we gained and lost in the Green Revolution in terms of taste and abundance. So check it out if anyone's interested in learning more.
Okay, excellent. Anyone else have questions? I'm just trying to scroll through. I don't see anyone else's hand up or anything. So I'll jump back in and hit the next page. And this is really one of the things I often talk a lot about of what's happening. Let's look and dive into some of these areas a little bit more detail. So ag biotech. I think this could be one of the most game-changing parts of the sector. But before I do that, I think maybe I'll take a step back and talk a little bit about this perspective as a whole from farm to fork. I like to tell people when I started looking at the sector back almost 7 years ago now, I spent most of my time, what I'd say on the left side, ag biotech, animal ag tech, automation, robotics, digital, fintech, maybe even a food waste and supply chain tech. What I realized not long after spending time in this industry was a lot of this was exactly the same as the clean tech 1.0 work I had done historically, which was B to B. And as I looked at it, one of the things that jumped out at me was B2B doesn't go quickly. Everyone might be jumping around sustainability, but companies don't move as quickly as consumers. And we were seeing people trying to sell into farmers who we all would acknowledge are not the easiest people to sell to. But what I also saw was alternative protein and indoor farming were B2C. And one of the things that really resonated with me is when I thought about some of the areas in clean tech that had really got a much more rapid market adoption, they were, let's say, residential solar, EVs, Nest thermostats, and they all had in common they were B2C because a consumer was looking for sustainability or new technology innovation. So I started spending a lot more of my time on alternative protein and indoor farming, because I think adoption was going to be quicker, and it turned out to be the case. Now, again, there's challenges on both of those industries. I'll talk more about that after, but I think adoption is important. And really, again, going back to what I said before, it's at the consumer level. And what does that mean? Well, that means the consumer is pressuring retail, the consumer is pressuring CPG to make changes. As you go through the rest of the buckets on here back down to the farm, I like to say that's going to take a little longer. I think we will have a similar moment to 15 years ago. Walmart went to its suppliers and said, you need to reduce your environmental footprint. You need to reduce your packaging. We're going to give you 3 years to do it. We're not going to pay you any more. But if you don't do it, we'll find other suppliers who will meet what we need. And I think over time, you're going to see a similar thing happening. Ultimately, a farmer is going to be told he needs to grow in a certain way, whether that's less chemicals and less pesticides, whether it's using more sustainable growing methods, whether it's cover crops, you name it. Something's going to happen and be pushed on them. And by the way, there might be an economic incentive. If you grow in this way, you're going to get a premium because a consumer wants that. And so to me, everything emanates from the consumer. It's going to get pushed down the supply chain, ultimately to the farmer. And that's going to lead to a lot of change around sustainability. And I think that's going to be good. So let's jump in on a couple of these topics. So let's start, say, with ag biotech. So what are we seeing here? Well, we're seeing some real interesting innovations in biologicals, whether it was Pivot Bio raising a big amount of money, whether it was Ag Biome raising a lot of money. You've got companies out there who are challenging the status quo of a future of chemical fertilizer and chemicals and pesticides. You've got companies out there that are saying, wait a second, we can do this differently. How do we do this differently? Well, let's use tech and innovation to be able to come up with new products that can replace a fertilizer, can replace a pesticide or a chemical. And I think that's going to accelerate. It also is in the area of what I like to talk about on the genetics side. When I first got into the ag tech area, I was talking with someone who I respected greatly, who told me everything starts from the seed in genetics. And if you build a better seed with better genetics, you're going to win and you're going to make money. And I always go back to that as to how and where does the innovation come from that's going to change how crops are grown. We talked about a challenging world of unpredictable weather. I don't think it's likely we're going to be using the same seeds 20 years from now that we use today. The weather patterns are changing. The temperature is changing. I don't think the farmer who grew in Iowa 20 years ago is seeing the same type of conditions today. And they probably are going to need to use seeds from, I don't know, somewhere 300-400 miles south, which that weather pattern now is moving up to Iowa. It's just a change. So we're seeing a lot of real innovation, a lot of investment into ag biotech. I don't think enough yet, if one was to believe that the genetics are the most important part, but it's a start there. On the animal side, I think we're seeing people talking more about how do we build a more regenerative and sustainable animal ecosystem. And clearly, the alternative protein industry wants to build a system without any animals. I still believe it's going to be a long while until that would be the opportunity, but it's there. But what else we need to talk about is how does it play into the ag sector and sustainability? And one of the things I often joke with people about is if you go back 5 years, no one ever talked about the environmental impact of ag. It was energy and it was transportation. And I often joke, one day someone woke up and said, we're putting all this money to support alternative energy. We're putting all this money to support EVs and EV infrastructure. And they looked down the list and said, okay, great, we've been successful. What do we do next? And someone said, wait a second, there's energy is 40% of greenhouse gases and transportation's 15 to 20, depending on how you measure it. But there's this sector in between called agriculture, and it's over 20% of emissions. Is anyone even dealing with this? And it was kind of this, all of a sudden, everyone just started to focus on ag tech. And that was about 5 years ago or so. And it's just accelerated. But a lot of it's on the animal side, particularly with the cows, that we've seen a lot of the issues from the environmental perspective. So whether it's new feed for cows to reduce methane or other technologies, it's a place where people are looking. Another one is on the automation and robotics side. Again, I mentioned before, I sit out in California where we have a lot of the specialty crops, the berries, the greens, and we've run into an issue where people just aren't available, whether it's picking, whether it's thinning, whether it's planting. We just don't have people. And as such, automation and robotics are going to be even more and more important, because if we don't have them, it's going to be a real challenge to be able to grow and to harvest. And I often say we can get away in the Midwest with waiting a little while to harvest. You don't want to, but you can. You don't really have that option in the specialty area. If you don't pick your berries when they need to get picked, they're not going to be worth very much the next day or 2 days later when they've passed their peak. The other area I think is really interesting is the carbon sequestration. It's an area we're hearing more and more people talk about. From my perspective, it's interesting because I've seen a number of different voluntary markets for carbon over a number of years, and typically they don't work out well. I'm actually relatively bullish on the carbon market for the ag sector. One of the reasons I'm bullish is because I think it's being driven by consumers rather than the government. And if it's being driven by consumers who are willing to put capital behind it, i.e. maybe willing to pay more or hold the brands that they work with feet to the fire to support it, it's more likely to be long-term, but it's still very early. And not only is the carbon market going to be important, but the verification and the monitoring of it to tell people that when you buy a carbon credit, it's actually worth something, rather than today when people wonder if they're buying a carbon credit, how many other people are buying that same credit. It's definitely a challenge there. Heading into the digital side, I think what's really interesting is from a digital perspective, whether it's drones or satellites in the sky, whether it's down to sensors in the ground, we're at a time where technology is ubiquitous in all these different industries in our lives. I don't know about any of you, but I couldn't even imagine going a couple hours having to put my phone away and not being able to look at it. Technology's there. We all use it. It's valuable. And I think that's going to accelerate. What we don't have now yet in many regards is enough technologies and platforms that are proven for precision agriculture that could be highly valuable to the farmer and could prove out its value. Now, conversely, I tell people I'm very bullish on fintech. And one of the reasons I'm bullish on fintech is, having worked at an ag bank like Wells Fargo, I can tell you they're not focused on using tech and innovation to mitigate risk. I was always surprised that risk wasn't the priority because tech was not taken into account. And I think that's going to change. I think you're going to see more and more non-financial institutions willing to use data and analytics to disintermediate a bank from its traditional customer, maybe even insurance, if they're unwilling to use technology to come up with good solutions to lower rates for people using data and to have this information to make informed decisions. A couple other things I talk about are food waste mitigation. I'm a big fan of what we're seeing, whether it's shelf life extension or, again, to the food waste problem I talked about, taking food that normally is misshapen or might be unused and turning it into smoothies, turning it into pet food, selling it to consumers. How do you take food that is nothing wrong and get it used so it's not wasted? It's really important. And in the supply chain as well, I talked a bit about that before. I like to say that supply chain, one of the bigger challenges is most consumers in the US assume that their food is safe. They might just want a quick validation. But in the developing world, there's a lot of people, particularly in China, who question whether their food actually is safe. And there are technologies to help them validate that the food is safe. But again, that costs money. And a consumer in China is willing to pay it because we know all the scares they've had over there in the past decade or so around food and where it comes from and isn't healthy. Developing world, whether it's North America or Europe, aren't really ready to pay for that yet. So I think that's going to be a little challenge in driving a lot of that. And then finally, going into alternative protein and indoor farming. On the alternative protein side, we've just seen a tremendous amount of consumer interest. Again, it looks like some of the growth of consumption has slowed, but I don't think the interest in alternative protein by any metric is slowing down. I think just the quality and the availability of product is the challenge. And I see it hitting many ways. We see the grasshoppers there, and I often joke, I see a future of bug protein. I'm not sure I see it for consumption by humans in the US anytime in the near future, but whether it's animal feed or whether it's aquaculture or pet food, I think that's definitely an opportunity. We've seen plant protein get some traction, but I actually think the future is fermentation and cellular in many regards. I don't think it's plant-based because I'm not sure the plants are going to get to the same taste, texture that other technologies will. And then on the indoor side, we've seen a lot of capital raised and a lot of companies build 1 or 2 facilities, most yet to be profitable. But the opportunity of indoor farming, particularly vertical farming, is really impressive, and what one can do with new genetics to grow and optimize by LED lights. How do we bring in some of these new products and grow them indoors that make the best strawberries or make the best blueberries or make better tasting and healthier food? I think all of that is going to be valuable, and I think the indoor farming sector, while it still has lots of challenges, particularly from a cost perspective, has great opportunities, particularly as challenging weather makes outdoor growing more difficult in the years to come. So I think this is a pretty broad perspective of how I look at the sector. I know we're heading towards the end. I have some few minutes, happy to stay around and answer other questions, but hopefully at least this has been helpful in talking through where the opportunities are, where we're seeing disruption and kind of the future around the food and ag sector.
Yeah,
Sarah,
definitely. I think John had a question for you.
Please, John.
Yeah. So Adam, I've got a question around kind of the carbon sequestration space. And do you see biodiversity as an important piece of that? And if you do you think corporations ignoring it is a problem?
So I have some colleagues and we have a what is it called? A sustainable future team, let's call them. That's really good at Citi, and they often talk about biodiversity. I will tell you, it's not a topic in my career we really have come across much and talked about. It's one that I think people are just starting to talk about. If you go into 100 consumers and ask their views on biodiversity, I would think 90 something of them will give you a blank look. And the ones who know anything will mention honeybees. I'm not sure society is educated enough, myself included, to really give a viewpoint on that. But if you talk to my colleagues, they will tell you that's one of the most important topics and people need to start thinking about it. But I would wonder today, I would say most people don't have any clue what it is, and it's going to be important how we could educate them so they get smarter.
Well, thank you, Adam. This was really, really insightful. You're one of my favorites. You know that. We're so lucky to have you part of the Plug and Play program, and so to share your insight and your knowledge. We truly appreciate you being here.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. And I appreciate the questions. It really made it more enjoyable to have people ask questions. So thank you all for that as well. And I wish you all success. And Sarah, I look forward to doing it the next time.
Yes, definitely. I'll get this recording out to you guys, and happy to share out Adam's contact information as well.
Please do.
All right. Have a great weekend.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Adam.
Bye-bye.
Bye.